Hello, and welcome to another lead up to Dreadnought video. Or, rather, a video leading up to the Dreadnought development history video. In this one, we'll be covering turret layouts of Dreadnoughts, since that is rather relevant to the Satsuma and Kawachi videos. I will be going over the major layouts of Dreadnought main batteries, while looking at each one and why it was adopted, as well as the flaws and advantages to each one. In the interests of not making this even longer than it already is, I won't be covering ships past the end of World War I. Or, for that matter, ships that weren't built, or at least completed, like Normandy or Lyon. They'll come eventually, just not in this video. Similarly, we'll see post-war concepts like all-forward gun layouts or the 3x3 typical of treaty battleships in another video. Since this one is focused on Dreadnoughts, it is only fair to start with the name ship herself. Dreadnought, in pioneering all big gun layouts, also began a trend in British battleship design, and to some extent other navies. That of the wing turret. Or rather, the full caliber wing turret. It was earlier ships that pioneered intermediate battery wing turrets. In the case of Dreadnought, and her nearly identical successors, the layout went as follows. A single turret on the bow, a pair of wing turrets on either side of the ship directly behind that, and then 2 further turrets on the center line. This amounted to 5 turrets and 10 guns, as these were still twin turrets at this point. The functional broadside, however, was 8 guns, as you could only ever bring the centerline turrets and 1 of the wing turrets to bear in any direction. As I've covered in other videos, though also here for the sake of collating information, this was done because the British had a, probably excessive, concern for superfiring turrets. The belief that blast effect from the upper turret would damage or otherwise cause issues with sighting hoods on the lower turret. Those, for reference, being little, hoods on top of turrets used for range finding and seeing out of the turret. There was a real concern that the blast effect of a superfiring turret would damage those or hurt the crew using it. Furthermore, there were still some conservative aspects to using wing turrets even beyond this. Concerns about the stability of such a high-mounted turret and barbette for a superfiring gun. A belief that ships would still close to relatively close range, and it would be advantageous to fire in all directions. Other weight concerns from concentrating everything in a small area. And, finally, at least for here, a concern that the concentration of guns would prove vulnerable in actual combat. That is, if you have 2 turrets right next to each other, a single hit could take them both out. Jumping ahead a tick, but you do see this particular concern rear its head again much later on with the Germans. There's a reason Bismarck has 4 gun turrets. With that out of the way, what are the pros and cons to this kind of layout? Well, the pros are relatively few and easy to get out of the way. It has good coverage of the main battery, being able to fire in all conceivable arcs with at least a couple turrets. There are no outright blind spots on a battleship using this layout. This layout also allows for firing in all directions, should combat get up close and personal like this was the Age of Sail. There's some truth to what the British were thinking in that regard, just as there's some truth to the British idea that it distributed weight. There were no heavy and tall barbettes. The weight of the main battery was spread throughout the ship, aiding in stability and avoiding the issue of concentrating mass in 1 or 2 areas. Laying out the turrets in this manner also means that a hit that disables one is highly unlikely to disable another, allowing the remaining turrets to continue fighting. Presuming that the ship doesn't blow up like a volcano. You also didn't have to worry about blast effect on the turrets, and they weren't wrong to be worried about that. They just worried a bit too much about it. Moving on, the cons are a bit more problematic. As mentioned, in using wing turrets, you are inherently limiting the viable broadside weight. 1 or more turrets is always going to be useless if the ship is only fighting enemies on one side. This limits the 10-gun ship to an 8-gun broadside. At least on Dreadnought's layout, it was only the 1 turret that couldn't be used. While it is true that weight isn't being concentrated in one or two areas, you have the issue of the weight of an entire turret being dead weight in most engagements. This could very quickly become an issue if you're trying to lower displacement or costs. You are, after all, eating the cost of two heavy guns that are rarely going to be used, as well as the weight of the turret. Furthermore, in spreading out the turrets, you are required to spend more tonnage on armor protection. After all, you have to have more coverage for the guns and magazines if they're spread out more. This is a problem for both the wing turrets and the amidships guns. You need to have heavier armor around the wing turrets. The added weight and stability issues of two turrets and barbettes hanging out to the side. As well as this, while the weight isn't being concentrated, wing turrets put their own kind of strain on the hull, and it requires a longer ship, and thus larger armor belt, to spread out the turrets along the whole length of the ship. Finally, the firing arcs are limited by, you guessed it, blast effect. What you save in potential siding hood issues, you lose in the fact that you cannot shoot directly ahead, or directly astern, without potentially damaging the deck or hull of the ship. In practical terms, and you see this as early as Dreadnought, you have to fire wing turrets at a slight angle to prevent damage to the ship herself. This causes issues with the prime advantage to wing turrets and more guns firing on either end of the ship. So, with this in mind, what was done to try and work around these issues? Well, that's where the on-echelon layout comes into play. In the second generation of British Dreadnoughts, and the first generation of the battlecruisers, you see this layout. In simplest terms, you take the wing turrets, and instead of mounting them side by side, you mount one slightly ahead of the other on the amidships area of the ship. In doing so, you maintain the advantages of the wing turret layout, while theoretically improving your broadside by allowing the turrets to fire to either end of the ship. This would preserve the advantages of the previous layout, while adding some new ones to the mix. It was also a fairly common design choice, seeing use in British and German designs, as well as some more minor powers. That being said, while popular enough, it wasn't without its own flaws. There are two advantages to this layout in comparison to the previous concept. First, you further spread out the weight of the turrets. No longer do you have two heavy turrets on either side of the ship right next to each other. This eliminates the weight and stability issue that you would have seen on Dreadnought. By moving the turrets to the amidships area, and in addition putting them slightly ahead and behind one another, you're spreading that weight out. This helps with stability. Not completely, but it does help. Secondly, you are avoiding the issues of one turret is dead weight in any broadside engagement. By having the turrets mounted ahead or behind of one another, you can now fire the starboard turret to port and vice versa. Provided, anyway, that there's no superstructure in the way. This means that you're no longer wasting guns or displacement in the way that previous designs did. 10 guns means 10 guns, not 10 guns means 8 in most situations. It is, of course, not that simple. You still maintain the issue of weight distribution and length of the ship. You're still spreading out your turrets, and by extension, the amount of area needing belt armor. If anything, these need even longer ships. As a result, this doesn't help displacement as much as it may seem at first glance. And it certainly doesn't help the needed weight of armor, as I mentioned. You are functionally trading the stability issues of the previous layout for needing even more armor coverage in this layout. This is further emphasized by many of these designs choosing to have one, or more, looking at Argentina here, super firing pair of turrets as well. You're then adding the potential weight concentration of those turrets to the issues with wing turrets. As well as this, and something I've gone over every time this layout comes up, you're still functionally wasting a turret in 90% of cases. For all that you can technically fire over the deck, the idea of cross-deck firing comes with its own problems and flaws. Blast effect is still an issue here. Any boats on the deck get turned into splinters. You can potentially damage the deck itself, and God help any crew that happen to be caught out when you're firing guns over their heads. So while you can shoot over the deck, in practice, most navies would only very rarely do it. Any superstructure could, of course, make these firing arcs even more limited in their own way. So, quite often, you're still seeing the same limited broadside as the older layout. There's just some edge cases where you can use all your turrets. As a result, while an improvement on the older style of wing turret mounting, the on-echelon layout comes with its own problems. Mind you, it could always be worse. France, because France always does its own thing, decided to look at the turret layouts of other navies and go off to do their own thing by sticking the two together. Remember what I mentioned about Argentina? The Rivadovias at least had on-echelon turrets for their midships to go with the two pairs of super-firing turrets. The French, with the Corbettes, had two pairs of super-firing turrets and a pair of traditional wing turrets mounted at the middle of the ship. Not on-echelon, the same kind of mounting style as Dreadnought, just moved back. This does mean you're having the same issue of wasting a pair of guns and the attendant weight, while also having whatever weight and stability issues one might see with early super-firing mounts. I'll give them this, it's one of the more unique ways to put guns on a Dreadnought. Anyway, the final wing turret I'll look at is the hexagonal layout. This is the layout you see on Kawachi or early German Dreadnoughts, wherein there is one turret on the bow and stern, just like pre-Dreadnoughts, but with 4 wing turrets instead of 2. This layout came about largely because of the insistence on old-school triple expansion engines. These took up a large amount of internal space compared to turbines, which made centerline turrets a bit problematic to use. You had limited internal volume for magazines or for the massive barbettes of the heavy turrets. Because of this, your options became either super-firing pairs of turrets, as in South Carolina, which also used triple expansion engines, or using the same layout as semi-dreadnoughts by spreading the turrets out on the wings. The Germans and the Japanese elected for the latter. This is what led to the hexagonal, or lozenge, layout. As one could probably expect, this carries the issue of wing turrets described earlier, but now you're doubling it. Instead of having 2 turrets on either side, you now have 4. While this still allows for an 8-gun broadside, you're now needing another extra turret on the wing to gain that number. At least as Dreadnought, you had centerline turrets spreading the weight out a little bit. Because you need 2 wing turrets on either side to gain this broadside, that means you need 2 extra turrets. So what would require 5 turrets and 10 guns with a Dreadnought layout now requires 12 guns and 6 turrets on the hexagonal layout. That's, as you could probably expect, a lot of added weight for what amounts to the same broadside. Even in regards to shooting a head or a stern, which is an argument made for this layout, it's still inefficient because the way the turrets are laid out precludes doing that. You can't shoot directly front or back if you're going to be shooting through your own turrets. I grant you it is spreading out the guns, and one could argue this is a good thing for survivability of the main battery. The Germans certainly made this argument. I do think there's a reason the Japanese ditched it after one go, though. Because there's no getting around how you have 2 turrets that can't be used most of the time, which is a nice point to move away from wing turrets and into centerline turret layouts, because these often save you money and weight. As well as this, in this case there's only really 2 distinctions of note, at least in this era. Super-firing or not super-firing. As it went away rather quickly, we'll focus with the second one first. All centerline, non-super-firing turrets. In this design concept, there are really only 2 navies of note, Italy and Russia. The Italians were the first, with their very first dreadnought, Dante. The Russians were soon to follow with, well, every dreadnought and battlecruiser ever designed or built by Imperial Russia. The basic conceit of this design is that you have all your main battery turrets mounted on the center line of the ship, which means that they can all fire on either broadside. Unlike wing turrets, you are not paying any cost in stability, and you don't have a turret hanging out uselessly on one side or the other in most engagements. This is inherently more efficient, insofar as you're not wasting weight or guns. Furthermore, you only have to worry about armoring the main belt instead of having extra armor to cover the turrets. As the vast majority of engagements would be of the lines of battle blasting away at one another kind, You don't lose that much by having only one turret available to fire directly ahead or astern, while maintaining every single gun for either broadside. Even if the turrets had been twins, both navies in this case went for triples, but let's imagine they were twins, it still would have been a more effective use of firepower because you're not wasting any weight on a turret you can't use most of the time. That being said, while the Russians were not, by all indications, copying the Italians here, it is interesting to see the parallel developments. There were, as one could expect if you're paying attention, the concerns about superfiring turrets and stability, as well as blast effect on siding hoods. If you don't care about axial, that's directly ahead or directly astern, fire, then having all the turrets mounted individually is the best way to get around those potential problems. It would also be more survivable insofar as the magazines are spread out too. And, I grant you, a single turret getting hit doesn't wipe out the one right next to it. This is not to say it is without its problems. As mentioned with the en-echelon layout, you're needing a longer ship for the same amount of guns and turrets. By spreading them out in individual mounts, you're required to have more space for the same broadside. This means a lengthier armor belt and more weight required to get the same thickness, or alternatively, to save weight, you can go with a thinner armor belt. That's also an option. In addition, your superstructure has to be either extremely minimalist or accept blocking the firing arc of your guns. The most problematic issue, though, is that magazines had to share space with machinery. This means steam pipes routed around them. It means heating up the magazines and the powder therein. This can cause all sorts of fun issues with long-term storage of powder and the accuracy of your guns. If you heat up the powder, it's not going to burn properly. For all that, though, it is more efficient than wing turrets, but it's still not the best use of space and tonnage. There's something of a reason the Italians would ditch it after Dante, leaving only the Russians holding to this kind of layout long-term. And everyone knows how the Russians are with navies. That aside, the final category of layout begins, though there are sub-variations to it. That layout, of course, being superfiring turrets. In simplest terms, placing two turrets with one slightly behind and above the other. Not, I should note, literally stacking turrets, though American pre-dreadnoughts did get up to that, and it's every bit as hilarious to look at as you would think. But I digress. The first battleship to do this was, as brought up in her own video, South Carolina. This was done to save tonnage and cost, allowing for the most possible firepower on the smallest hull. For this, nothing really is better than superfiring. You can cram 8 guns onto a short and stout hull without the need for wing turrets, without having to build a long ship to fit the same 4 turrets all on the center line, but not superfiring. I believe it's rather telling that all navies would soon follow this practice to some extent or another, even the stubborn ones. Such as they are, the disadvantages to superfiring turrets are largely minor in comparison to the flaws in other layouts. Blast effect on the siding hoods turned out to be something of a minor issue, unless you were deliberately firing your guns in such a way as to make it an issue, and the US Navy would actually try this when they were deciding to do superfiring turrets and found it was not much of an issue. And even that minor problem could be mitigated by moving the siding hoods to the side of the turrets instead of directly on top of them. This is why you see the bunny ears on basically every turret past a certain point. The disadvantages to superfiring turrets are honestly largely minor. Stability could be a problem insofar as you have high up barbettes for the top turret in superfiring pair, as well as the fact you're concentrating all the weight in 2 spots on the ends, which could cause issues with twisting and the like. Again, this was kind of a small issue in actual service, provided you're not being stupid and building your ships as lightly as humanly possible. And yes, you could see a hit disable both turrets if you got incredibly unlucky. It is worth noting, mind you, that having the magazines concentrated did not prove much of an issue in combat. The ships lost at Jutland, for example, were not lost because they had superfiring turrets and concentrated magazines, excepting perhaps Queen Mary. These are pretty minor concerns, really, compared to the inbuilt advantages. As mentioned, you could cram more firepower onto a smaller hull. You could concentrate your weapons and create a much heavier broadside for fewer turrets and guns. It was entirely possible to get the same broadside as a ship with wing turrets without needing to have extra guns you're not going to use most of the time. In fact, it was possible to get an even heavier broadside, as demonstrated by later ships going for super-firing guns and amidships turrets. The British were particularly fond of this. As for armor protection, well, having a smaller ship for the same firepower allowed for better armor protection too, without the need to spread it out. South Carolina had heavy armor for a reason. By placing the turrets close together, you eliminated the need to put a bunch of heavy armor to cover turrets spread out across the ship. Fire control was simplified by placing the guns together. There was no need to spread out your fire control stations. Blast effect damage to the hull was sharply reduced because you didn't have wing turrets firing into the superstructure, or on-echelon turrets wrecking the deck to try firing on the opposite broadside. In fact, all the guns could fire on either broadside without any issues whatsoever. And as ships got bigger, you could fit more and more guns without losing that effectiveness. With wing turrets, you quickly hit a point of diminishing returns. With center-firing turrets, there's a reason turret farms are a thing. While the traditional layout of 4 twin turrets to super-firing pairs established by South Carolina would prove to be an enduring one, there are exceptions. For example, the Austrians, of all people, would come up with the idea of triple turrets and super-firing pairs, allowing for 12-gun broadsides that only required 4 turrets. I will grant you, the ships in question had real issues with the design of those turrets, but the idea was sound, and there's no surprise people copied it. The Italians, meanwhile, would go off and do mixed number turrets. You had twins and triples, making for a slightly less powerful broadside with the super-firing turrets themselves, but saving weight and stability, while packing a more heavy broadside overall, by virtue of putting a triple in the middle of the ship, giving a 13-gun broadside. There are some weird holdovers here, like the previously mentioned corbeille, though. You would also see on-echelon mixed with a single super-firing pair. Generally, that's going to be on the stern, with the 2 on-echelon turrets and then a single bow turret. But by and large, some combination of super-firing and individual turrets would become the standard. For most of the Great War, you'd see 2 pairs of super-firing turrets, with some wiggle room in regards to maybe having a 5th turret by its lonesome. This period also saw the previously mentioned turret farms. That's when you had 6 or more turrets on a single ship. The Japanese were especially fond of this in their Fuso and Issei designs. The former had 2 pairs of super-firing turrets, and then 2 twin turrets, split by a funnel between them. The latter put those 2 individual turrets into a 3rd super-firing pair, simplifying the layout while maintaining the same 12-gun broadside. You see a similar development in American designs between South Carolina and New York. Delaware and Florida shared their gun layout, with a somewhat bizarre one of a super-firing pair on the bow, an individual turret behind the superstructure and the second funnel, and then the final 2 turrets mounted literally back-to-back on the back end of the ship. For her part, Wyoming would have 6 turrets and 3 super-firing pairs along the entire length of the ship, which is both more efficient and less weird-looking. 2 turrets on the bow, then 4 on the stern, in 2 distinct pairs. With New York, you get into something like the British practice with a bow and stern pair of super-firing turrets and a single individual turret between the pairs. After this, American battleships revert back to the South Carolina standard of 2 super-firing pairs, albeit they pretty quickly moved to triple turrets instead of twin turrets. The last distinction for actually built Great War-era battleships is HMS Agincourt, wherein 5 or 6 turrets isn't enough, we need to have 7. Agincourt had the typical 2 super-firing pairs, but then went a step further and had 2 turrets on the amidships, back-to-back like the early American Dreadnoughts, and then there was a turret sitting in front of the stern pair of super-firing turrets, getting her up to 7 turrets and 14 guns. No other battleship has ever had more turrets, though there were designs with more guns. Alas, though, that brings us to an end for actually built dreadnoughts. Because past this point, you're getting out of dreadnoughts and super dreadnoughts and into completely different designs. I'll cover them. Don't worry. I'll cover Nelson. I'll cover G3 and N3. I'll cover Normandy. I'll cover Iowa. Just not in this video. For now, I hope those of you who stuck around to the end enjoyed the video at least. If there's anything you want covered in more detail, feel free to let me know. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next video.